Ooh, brilliant. Thank you to the organisers for such an amazing day. I feel that I've learnt so much from this, and actually thank you very much for everyone who's actually stayed till the last sort of presentation, because it's been sort of a long and pretty exhausting day. So I'm here to talk to you on behalf of myself and Professor Howard Tumber about the work that we have done on researching the journalism of Alistair Cooke and working across these two archives, BBC Caversham and the Howard Gotlieb Archival Research Centre based in Boston University. So talking about forgotten things, letter from America. I'm trying to think, when given the response to Just 17, hopefully there is a demographic in here that might remember Letter from America. But basically, for those of you who may not have come across him, Alistair Cooke was a Guardian and BBC journalist. He moved to the US in 1937 after being the BBC's film correspondent, and basically made up this sort of program that ran for more than 6 decades. Started off being called American Letters and then was renamed Letter from America. He had 15 minutes over these years, 2,860 episodes. As I say, the longest running speech radio program hosted by one individual. And although it is often largely forgotten, I'd say now, this was an amazing kind of influence that you could have, basically explaining the US to Britain for all these years. So he described it when he and Lindsay Wellington, who's then the BBC controller of programmes in 1946, they talked about it as a sort of a personal letter to Britain, a fireside chat about American life and people. But Cooke really had this kind of freedom to talk about what he wanted to do, which often might be things like golf and jazz, which were his particular sort of loves, but also, to frame, American political and cultural life. And beam out on this sort of what was then the Home Service, but obviously Radio 4 and also the World Service as well. Now, how I kind of came across this was actually I came across it by chance. I was doing another project and was in sort of Radio 4, and they just found these scripts in very BBC style that someone had in their attic, sort of some recordings of Letter from America. And what was kind of extraordinary to me from an academic point of view is that no one had looked at Cooke at all over the sort of 20 or so, well, sort of, it was nearer 15 years when we started this, but 15 or so years since the end of Letter from America, and even before that. So we were sort of, Professor Tumber and I were lucky enough to be funded by the British Academy back in sort of 2020. And these were kind of our aims, to look at someone who had not really been looked at before, to analyse the kind of particular form of journalism that Letter from America was, how it relates to existing literature, but also to look at, his own reflections on what he felt the role of a foreign correspondent was, and his own reflections on his own journalism, and then particularly to analyse the contents of Letter from America and his influence on the British public sphere. So anyway, realised very quickly why people didn't really research Cooke, because the complexity of this was pretty manifold, and as anyone who works in archives, I'm sure would agree. With this, we had the kind of complication that we needed permission from both the Cooke family and from the BBC over this, because both of them, I'll explain why in a minute, sort of felt strongly about this. And also added to that, the archive, sort of Cooke's sort of correspondence and scripts were spread over 2 different places. So some of it's in Caversham, some of it's in the Howard Gotlieb Archive Research Centre, and it's not often clear why some things are where they are. So, for example, some of Cooke's original scripts are in the BBC, the ones that he sort of typed out himself, whereas you'd think they'd be in the archive in Boston, but not the case. And there was a particular problem that actually took us forever to work out, I don't know if people have had this sort of particularly as well, but the kind of the IP questions, because obviously we wanted to quote from this. But we had Cooke's original scripts that he typed. We had this transcript that the BBC did after broadcast. We had the audio itself, and basically, a huge sort of civilized discussion over who owned the IP for which one, and as I say, complicated by the fact that some of Cooke's scripts, his original ones, were in the BBC archive of Caversham, and some of the transcripts seem to be like sort of over in the How Gotlieb. How these ended up where they did, sort of is a question for another academic sort of PhD, career. And also there was what was kind of interesting sort of to me as well, there was concerns from the family about a project on Cooke. Previously, the only work that had been done on Cooke was an authorised biography that had been written by Nick Clark, former presenter of The World at One. And of course, Clark, as an independent journalist, was not doing a hagiography, but he was still a BBC person. And there was also an unpublished MA on it, which had looked sort of over the years. And one of the things it had looked at was the changes in the different scripts over Cooke and race. So as soon as the family heard that anyone was then going to do some academic research, they were worried that this could sort of be detrimental to Cooke's reputation as well. And also there's a kind of, I think journalists have, a sort of an idea about what is the value of a journalist's archive, what is the correct form of an archive. And journalists themselves are often bad at keeping, sort of relevant material, or in the case of Cooke, keeping lots of stuff that you're sorting through and you've got no idea why he's actually kept it. So in terms of challenges, great. So we got the money from the BA, and I think we got it in sort of February 2020. So if you're going to talk about sort of a great challenge, is really start a BA sort of grant, which involves going to different archives as soon as a worldwide pandemic. This was probably the greatest sort of challenge, because those of you, I think, who've worked in Caversham over the last few years will remember quite how restricted it was for a long time, both during and after the pandemic. And then I couldn't even get to Boston forever. And then they had been really hard hit by the pandemic. They had had staff made redundant. So actually them catering for me being there, and then saying things like, oh, well, you can come for 1 day a week for 4 weeks. And I'm like, I can't do that. There's a huge archive. Anyway, took a lot of negotiation. And also, while I went to Boston, I sort of went to see Susan Cooke Kittredge, who's Cooke's daughter, who lives in Vermont, who also held archival material that neither sort of How Gotlieb or the BBC were aware of. So all very sort of interesting. So maybe that should have been the slide that says challenges while conducting research. But then this is some of the things that we faced, as I say, that will be familiar to anyone who has worked in this kind of area. So, but particularly for Cooke, there's also some edited collections of Cooke's work, of some Letter from America scripts. These are given a different name to the ones that are given in the BBC scripts transcripts, and then obviously Cooke's immediate scripts either have no titles on them at all, or sort of have another one. So finding out which one was which, was a sort of a huge challenge. Many of the scripts are still kind of hard copy only, and with all the scribbles over them because of the changes that both Cooke made, or it's impossible to to digitize. And then a lot of the scripts were ordered according to the broadcast schedule, so it's not coming up as Letter from America. You had to kind of go through the whole microfiche. And a pretty limited inventory at How Gotlieb, and Cooke's work spread over numerous files at the BBC. One of the biggest challenges for me is Cooke was an inveterate hoarder. So there was a limited inventory, and I'd open boxes and they would be literally full of letters that school children had written to Alistair Cooke as part of a school project. and you'd be going through them thinking there's got to be something in here as well. Oh no, there isn't. And actually there's no, there is, I'm not going to find Barack Obama has written to Alistair Cooke. I looked through lots and lots of them just in case there was sort of something like that, but not. And as I say, also some items were held by the family. So this is a diary that Susan Cooke Kittredge showed to me when I went to Vermont, and it's actually you can see Cooke's draft number because obviously he'd become an American citizen, and this was kind of just something that no one had kind of looked at before, and which sort of was coming out of nowhere. But I think the value of doing this is what it sort of revealed was looking at the stuff that we were trying to look at to understand Cooke's influence and how this sort of program that explained America to the UK and beyond was what we discovered from doing it was thinking, looking at the different picture of Cooke. So by the time Alistair Cooke sort of retired shortly before his death in 2004, he was seen as this kind of BBC, sort of grand man for broadcasting. But if you look back in the early archives, they're always trying to sack him, and they think he's hopeless and he can't speak on the radio. They talk about him sounding like a horse because he's breathing too heavily. So it was interesting to see how this character and this commitment by the BBC to Letter from America sort of changed. There was also the conflicts between him and editors that sort of Susan Cooke Kittredge talked about, but is reflected in the archive. This is kind of a typical letter about saying how awful he is at meeting deadlines, and Cooke sort of replying saying it's going to be there, don't worry, the script's going to be there. But also, I think what was interesting about it was to look at this kind of narrative literary journalism tradition and whether Cooke falls into it as well. And there, what the archive revealed was his own thoughts. So, there's a quote there from, he has a long correspondence with Isaiah Berlin and sort of talks about sort of what he sees a journalist as. And his view of what a foreign correspondent is different to what we would often see as the kind of the idea, which I'll talk about in a second. But what was also useful about doing this is when you have a program that runs for nearly 60 years, like Cooke's does, is the kind of historical context. And so by looking at, for example, at Letter from America, in 1992, he's drawing heavily on his memory of the Watts riots, sort of back in 1965. And you can go back and listen to both and see how the reporting has changed. There's also the idea of how you can compare his outputs. So this is him reporting for The Guardian on Robert F. Kennedy's assassination versus the Letter from America. But just briefly to say, this is how he defines a sort of a foreign correspondent, that you're never there at the right moment. And the fact that he was there when RFK was assassinated was particularly sort of unusual for a foreign correspondent. So just really quickly, given I've sort of had to wrap up, just to say, I think there's sort of a really interesting thing about how archivists acquire archives, how Gotlieb wanted famous people for his archive, spent a long time luring Cooke. Cooke was very dismissive of the idea, but basically did it for the tax benefits. So, I think thinking about motives around archives is interesting. And also maybe the cooperation with the BBC. There was a joint website between the BBC and Howard Gotlieb, which has now been taken down, and that is because of the way Boston University now works, because of money, and then the Cooke estate investigating possible alternatives. So just to conclude, it's an ongoing process compiling the full list of the LFA scripts, broadcast transcripts for the first time, as talked about. A whole issue raised around archiving journalistic work, and I'm now involved in a pilot study at City looking at this, what the value of journalism archives is and how you work with journalists to get them to preserve their work. And then also, how can contemporary communities, as say, engage with old ephemera, which a lot of the Letter from America archive is. Thank you. Yes, up to but there was, because we wanted to, part of the BA project is to write a book about it. And so there was extreme nervousness about, obviously you explained we're academics. There is no way this is going to be a bestseller, top of the charts, if three, but there was a real nervousness around from both the Cooke family and the BBC about how much we could actually use, what we could use, could we compare? Right. So that was where the kind of the debate was. Although anyone who wants to buy a book about Cooke, please feel free to to do so.